Meta, the company that owns Facebook, is under fire in Kenya. Its workers there are suing, complaining they'd been subjected to inhumane working conditions, including forced labor, irregular pay, and no right to unionize. The case was brought by Daniel Motang, a former content moderator for a Facebook subcontractor. He says he had to review content such as rape, torture, and beheadings without mental health support. This week, a Labour court in Nairobi ruled that Meta can face a lawsuit in Kenya. That's after the tech giant tried to have the case dropped, arguing that Kenya's courts did not have jurisdiction over its operations. We reached out to Meta since the ruling was announced, and they responded saying they cannot comment on ongoing legal matters. And Meta is facing a second lawsuit in Kenya. Two individuals and a rights group say the tech giant failed to respond properly to hateful content on its platform, Facebook, as relating to the war in Ethiopia's Tigray region. One of the plaintiffs says Facebook failed to take down hate speech. Abraham Emereg, seen here on the left, says Meta's lack of action led to his father's killing. Mereg Amare Abra, a chemistry professor in Ethiopia, was on his way home from work when he was shot in the back and legs. This happened right after two Facebook posts called for his murder. To look deeper into these two cases against Meta in Kenya, I'm joined now by Irungu Houghton. He is the Amnesty International Kenya Executive Director. Welcome to DW News Africa. Now, just looking at this High Court ruling announced earlier this week, how did you feel when you heard the news?
Well, at Amnesty International, we were delighted by the judgment that actually the Kenyan Court of Law is not only capable, but will be listening to the evidence by Daniel Motang in this particular case. So I think we can only just say that we were delighted. It's also very globally significant and historic in the sense that this is probably the first time that a huge social media platform like Meta, Facebook, will be held accountable in a court of law outside of the United States of America and Europe.
Right. And what does this mean on the ground for content moderators like Daniel Motang, you mentioned, who brought this case against Meta?
I can only believe that they must be sighing relief and the sense of vindication, in the sense that for many years now, content moderators have complained that that they are, face an impossible task. I mean, if you think about the role of a content moderator, you have to sift through thousands of pages, endless content, visual and print content that in many times, in many ways can be toxic. It can be violent. You have to look through very gory images of sexual violence, potentially also issues around bestiality. And they've been complaining for a long time that they just don't have the tools to be able to do this work properly. And they are just too few, dealing with too much information. I think one of the things that has really deeply concerned us by Daniel Motang's case is how he has said that, much of the work that he does has left him almost with a case of post-traumatic stress. He has complained that, epilepsy, a condition that he had when he was a child, came back in the employment while he was employed by SummerSource, of course, the third-party provider for Facebook Meta. And I think for organizations like Amnesty, we are calling on Facebook to take responsibility, not just for the working conditions of their content moderators, but really the impact that their platforms have on millions of people across the world.
And what are these measures in particular, these tools you're talking about that need to be put in place to make sure that these content moderators are protected?
So there are four practical things. The first is that they should use kill switches to essentially stop advertising and boosting of posts, particularly where the content is hateful or violent. The second thing they can do is increase the number of content moderators that can operate in several languages. In the case of Ethiopia, the 2-year conflict in Tigray, much of the content was in Amharic and Tigrinya. It is the case that actually there is not enough African, content moderators working in different languages. And the third thing, I think, is really essentially moving much faster to drop content or to pull down content where it is deemed to be hateful. And we have to be clear, this is not really an issue of freedom of speech. It is really a question of how do you make sure that content that is violent, that content that is discriminatory, that this content has no place on platforms like Facebook and others.
And beyond the content moderators, we have, people like Abraham Mirag Amare, who is the son of a murdered Ethiopian professor. He's taking Meta to court as well, alleging that the company is responsible for his father's death. Can you tell us more about his case briefly?
No, it's really tragic. I mean, if you listen to the testimony of the two petitioners that have taken Meta to court, and in particular, Professor Abraham, who was targeted over several days on several pages on Facebook, and they started off, talking about him personally. They revealed where he worked. He was a professor at Bahada University. They then began to spread a lot of falsehoods, and then came the photographs of places where he frequented, his office, the university property. And, the tragic thing about him was that he was alerted that this was happening. And many of the people who saw it actually alerted Facebook to take down these posts, but Meta took no action. And sadly, the professor argued that, he wasn't even on Facebook himself, but he argued that their decades of community service would protect him. And unfortunately, what we saw was he was essentially shot down as he left the university one day and left bleeding in the street. And that's all really, due to the advanced intelligence that people were able to gather and share on Facebook.
And what do the plaintiffs want?
Well, the plaintiffs, it's a class action suit. It's a bit like Daniel Montang's case, in the court, in the employment and labor court. For the case of Fiseha and Amare, they are basically calling for compensation, essentially to be put in a fund to help people who are either attacked or harmed emotionally by the viciousness that is sometimes seen on Facebook. So they're actually calling for a fund to be set up to essentially manage well-being and mental health of people who are targeted using the platform. But unfortunately, it's now been pushed by a couple of months. So we hope that the Kenyan courts do not delay this any further, because I think it's important that we get to a resolution of this particular case. And once again, this will be globally significant in the sense that it will essentially open the door for other jurisdictions across Africa, Asia, and Latin America to essentially hold Meta responsible for the content that it allows to be shared on its platforms.
Irungu, you're on Kenya's Council for Responsible Social Media, and the statement there says that the current social media system is broken. So what needs to be done to fix it?
Yeah, so the council released a report actually a week ago, just around World Privacy Day, and it was a national opinion poll on for Kenya, and what we found was a number of things. One was that 47% of Kenyans are now familiar with fake news on social media platforms, and Facebook has 90% of that. And I think the other thing that was interesting from that study was that 70% of Kenyans now want social media platforms regulated either by the government or self-regulated by the platforms. So I think what we're beginning to see is a growing trust deficit among Kenyans towards social media platforms because they're failing to regulate. And I think that's the biggest cost that these institutions will have. The other cost will be, of course, is these very costly class action suits that are beginning to develop. And of course, they've been happening in places like Europe. But this could be the first time that we see a case like this in the global south.
Right. Irungu Houghton, Amnesty International Kenya Executive Director. Thank you for speaking to us.